Hi everyone, I'm Tristan Lee from Layer0. Welcome to getting started with GraphQL and caching on Next.js, Apollo, and Layer0. Today's talk is going to be hands-on with GraphQL. Our stack for this will be the popular Next.js framework, Apollo client for front-end fetching, and Apollo server as our GraphQL endpoint on our serverless tier, and this will all be running on Layer0. The task today will be converting a REST API to GraphQL, and then at the end, as a bonus, we will be using Layer0 to cache the GraphQL API at the edge. If you're not familiar with Layer0 by Limelight, we're basically a production-ready, modern web hosting in a box. Everything you need from serverless, CDN, observability, RUM, and more. We have support for all the most popular frameworks, and in today's demonstration, we will be using Next.js. One of the key features we are rolling out is GraphQL Caching. This means you can cache the response of that GraphQL query at the edge. As you may know, GraphQL uses POST requests even when you're just trying to query cacheable data, and most CDNs are built on the assumption that only GET requests are cacheable. But with Layer0 by Limelight, you can cache those at the edge with our features. You can also cache your GraphQL entities based on data in the response, which I will demonstrate later in the video. Layer0 can also be used for third-party GraphQL endpoints. Today I'm demonstrating using GraphQL in a serverless environment, but the same functionality is available if your GraphQL API is hosted elsewhere. Cache clearing can be done within our UI or our API, and coming soon we will have support for purging the cache on mutations. So for example, when a mutation is made to update product information, the cache for that will automatically be purged and fresh for future requests. With that being said, let's jump into what GraphQL is if you're not familiar. So GraphQL is a specification that describes the behavior of a GraphQL server. It's really a set of guidelines on how requests and responses should be handled, like supported protocols, format of the data that can be accepted by the server, format of the response returned by the server, and so on. GraphQL is not a graph database query language. You can use GraphQL to query data from any number of sources. It's not tied to things like the transport layer. It can be used with any available network protocol like TCP, WebSockets, or any other transport layer protocol. It is unopinionated with databases, so you can use it with relational or NoSQL databases. And for backend languages, there are many open source GraphQL servers that you can incorporate into your web application. We encourage you to investigate and choose your own. In today's example, I will be taking an existing REST API as the data source for feeding our GraphQL server. Let's dive into what that looks like. Currently, our application is fetching directly from an internal REST endpoint that is also hosted on Layer0. The API can be called from the client or during server-side rendering. The change I will be demonstrating today adds the Apollo client library to fetch using GraphQL queries from the browser. The change I will be demonstrating today adds the Apollo client library to fetch using GraphQL queries from the browser, first hitting Layer0 for edge cache logic and serverless handling of our GraphQL backend, which resolves against the same REST API. So this is the basic demonstration of the existing Next application we already have. I'm going to start up the Next.js local dev server, and then we'll switch over. And the example application just consists of a header with a few different categories. Within each category is different products, and then the product itself. So the way this application works is we have different next pages, one for category and one for product. Both are very similar. We have an existing library that I've called here CMS, which is just a handler for going out and fetching from our existing REST API. The REST API is located here, and it just consists of JSON data. So we could do a fetch to get different categories, to get a specific category, and then lastly by a specific product. So an example of what that response might look like. you can see it just returns an array of product information given a specific category. So this is the type of data that we will consume with our GraphQL handler. So to get started with that, we first need to install a few libraries. We're going to be installing Apollo Client, which is going to do our front-end fetching, and then we use our Apollo Server Micro, which is going to handle the GraphQL requests as they come in. GraphQL for the support, and then we include the microcores library. This is what allows us to use the GraphQL Studio interface when working from a local dev environment. So let's copy this and install these. So let's talk about the directory structure we're going to have here. First, we're going to create a GraphQL directory, and this is just going to hold some of the library components that we will be using within the API. The first one being the schema, which is going to contain the type definitions of the graphs for the data that it will contain. We'll create a resolvers, which has various functions for populating the data into the field. And then queries, which is going to be used on the front end for when we're fetching data on the client. So first, let's talk about the schema. As I mentioned, the schema is going to contain all the type definitions for the different graphs. So I've already put together an example of how the graphs will match our existing data set that we'll be fetching from the REST API. So first we import GQL from Apollo Server Micro, and then we define the different types. One being the category, which is going to consist of the category name, which is just going to be like a visual display name, the URL to that specific category, and then the items within it, which is going to be of type product. And within the product, we have the ID, description, name, picture, so on and so forth. Below that, we define a few different queries. Query of type categories is going to be an array of all category types. Products of category will be passed the name of the category and will turn an array of products within that category. And then finally, product itself will take a specific product ID and return just that product. Next, we'll take a look at the resolvers. As I mentioned before, the resolvers are basically functions that just go out and fetch the data and populate the GraphQL entities with that data. So these resolvers will match what we defined previously in the schema. So what we are doing is I am importing the CMS library that I mentioned earlier, which makes our fetch requests to the REST endpoint. So our resolver query for categories is going to go out and fetch the categories and return that array. And this array matches the schema that we have defined here. Same for products of category, where it's being passed a argument name and returns an array of products. And then lastly, product, which is passed argument ID and returns that specific product. And then lastly, we'll define the queries that we're going to use on the front end. Because these are being used on the front end, we'll import GQL from the Apollo client library. And here we define our query names. For the categories, we'll call it get categories, and it just turns back the category name and the URL to that category. Products by category, similarly, we give it the category name and it returns an array of products for that category. And then get product takes a product ID and returns an entity of type product with these specific fields. So the next step is to create a GraphQL endpoint that's going to handle these queries from the client. And we'll use that using the Next.js Pages API. So we'll come over here and create a new folder called API and a new page called GraphQL. And we're going to populate this with just a very basic handler that uses the Apollo Server Micro and micro cores. Now, cores is going to be used for the Apollo Studio and how it connects to our localhost dev server. So we need that to across origins. So what we need to do is, in this handler, we'll create a new Apollo server, and we'll pass in the type definitions of our schema and then our resolvers. And then we'll come down here and start the server. And then we define an asynchronous handler, which will wait for the server to start, and then it'll create its own handler at the exact same path that we defined here under the Next.js pages. And this takes a request and a response object that is modified and returned back to the client. We also define a Next.js configuration object that disables the body parser for the API path, as this is not needed. The GraphQL requests are parsed automatically. So let's start the server up. Let's navigate to /API/GraphQL. This should redirect us to Apollo Studio, where we can verify that our GraphQL service is up and running. So I'm just going to run a couple queries here, one against categories and then another one against product of categories with the parameter hats, just to verify that we're getting everything back that we expect. Let's go back to our application, and now we need to modify the category and product pages to fetch using the Apollo client. The first thing we'll do is to come into the category page. So now what we want to do is we want to import the use query hook, which is made available in the Apollo client library. And we also need to import our products by category query. So now down here in the body of the function, I'm going to paste a snippet of code here that uses the use query hook, and we pass in our products by category query. And then we're also going to pass in a variable of the slug that's being used in the request. So on the left-hand side, if you look at our pages, category, and then name.js file, the name of the slug being used is going to be passed in as a server-side prop. And so we want to pass that to our query so that we know that we want to query specific products for the category page that we're currently on. And then we do a few other checks. We check to see if it's loading. If we're currently loading, we just return null. Otherwise, we check for errors and ensure that we actually have products in the category. Otherwise, we will just display that no products have been found. Otherwise, we come down here and we can iterate over the data, and as defined in our queries, this will come back as products of category. So we'll copy the name of that and then save. So actually, one thing we forgot to import was the actual Apollo client that's going to be used within the application. So we need to come over to GraphQL and create a new file. This is going to export a new Apollo client with the URL for our GraphQL endpoint. And then in our main app, come in here and import Apollo provider. And then we just wrap the whole document with the Apollo provider in our client instance. So with those changes, let's switch back to the browser and refresh the category. And as we can see, the products are being fetched using the Apollo client library. So now I'll head back to the editor and make similar changes to the product page. So I'm going to import the Apollo client and also our product query. And I just need to go through and update some of the variable names. So what was the product of categories now becomes product. And then I just need to update get server-side props to include just the slug that we need for this particular product. Our metadata information needs to come down below where the product's defined, and I just need to update the name of the variable that gets passed to the query. Now coming back to the category page, let's check out one of the products. And we can see that all the product information is correctly loaded. We need to go through and inspect just to verify some of the GraphQL queries that are coming through. So when I load this particular category, we can see the payload that's been sent, get products of category, and the actual query name along with the variable. So as I mentioned before, this is the slug that's actually watches, that's actually part of the URL up here. So this just gets passed in as the variable and is used within the query. And then just looking at the product information, we see a very similar payload, get products with a specific product ID, and it returns all the JSON data for that particular product. So the next thing we want to do, actually, now that we have all the GraphQL endpoints working, we need to add Layer0 in front of this. And adding Layer0 in front of your GraphQL endpoint is going to benefit you because right now we don't have any caching available on these requests. And because they're post requests, adding caching in a traditional method is a bit more difficult. But with Layer0, we have the Layer0 router that we can use to define specific GraphQL operations and then define our own custom cache mechanism for actually caching these post requests. So let's go over here at the code and take a look how that would be set up. So the first thing we need to do is actually initialize the product with Layer0. Because this is a previously used Next.js example that we have hosted live on our platform, it actually already has Layer0 already initialized, but I'll show you real quick just how to get started with that if you have a brand new project that isn't using Layer0 at all. First, head over to our documentation at docs.layer0.co, and then you can go down under the framework guides on the left-hand side and look for the framework that you're using. In this case, we're using Next.js. And we just go down here to the Getting Started section. What we need to do is actually install the Layer0 CLI globally. So you can just copy this command and it will just install everything globally for you. And then the next step would actually be to change directories into your project and then run Layer0 init. And what this is going to do is actually going to update your project dependencies and include all of the necessary Layer0 dependencies needed. And it's going to add a few more scripts to package.json as well that helps actually launch your application under the Layer0 server instead of just the basic Next.js development server. And then it also creates a routes.js file, which is really just the router that sends all the requests to Next.js. So this is actually what we're going to be modifying now to handle all the caching for the post requests. So like I said, because this has already been initialized with Layer0, we already do have a routes.js. And I've kind of come in here and just populated it already with a little bit of information that we're going to need to get started. So right now I've defined just a variable API path, which is going to be the path where all of our GraphQL requests come into. And then I've defined a configuration object here that basically says on the Layer0 edge network, we want to cache these requests for a maximum of 1 hour, and we use stale while revalidate for 1 day. And so we have 3 different operations that we need to define here. The get categories, get products of category, and then get product. So on the actual router instance that's being exported, we can just add a new item here, and we can start with the GraphQL operation handler. And what this does, it'll take it takes a string value, which could be the name of your operation. And if you pass just a string value, it assumes that your GraphQL endpoint is going to be just /GraphQL. Because ours is actually /API/GraphQL, we need to modify it a little bit, and instead we need to pass an object into it, which gives the path to the API as well as the name of the operation. So let's define path here as the API path, and then name is going to be get category for our first operation. And then the next argument to this function is actually going to be the cache handler of the response writer that the router handles. So we can destructure the cache function from the handler here and simply just call cache and then pass it our cache configuration that we defined above. And then so now whenever our router is executed on layer 0, it's going to come through and build out all the routes that we have defined here and set a specific cache mechanism for this GraphQL operation of get categories. And even now that it's going to be a post request, it's going to be cached for 1 day, as 1 hour that we have defined up here. And so let's go through and we'll just add the other two operations as well while we're in here. So now with the cache configuration all set up, let's actually launch the application under layer 0. So before we actually started it with npm run dev, which if we look at package.json, is going to start the development server under Next. But since we initialized the project with layer 0, it injected some scripts here for us, and we can actually run layer 0 dev. And what this is going to do is actually going to compile the layer 0 router, and then it's going to start up the actual Next dev server in the background. And so all requests that come through are actually going to come through layer 0 first. And then if they're requests that need to go to Next.js, they'll actually be proxied to the backend Next.js server that's up and running. So instead, as a shortcut, we can just do 0 dev, and it'll start the layer 0 project in development mode. So with that started, let's switch back over and go back to our application here. We'll start from the very beginning just to verify everything's loading correctly. And let's take a look at hats. So if we inspect the request now, we can see that we know this has actually been served from layer 0 because we have a few different headers now. The first one being the X0 cache control, which has a max age defined of 3600 seconds, which is the hour that we defined for our edge request. And then you can see X0T, which is some additional headers used for telemetry information served by layer 0. So we could validate that both our product and category pages are actually being served through layer 0 with the correct cache control headers that we defined. So one of the other features that I mentioned earlier was being able to set a surrogate key for specific GraphQL operations. And one of the benefits of this is, say for example, on this product that we have here, in the event that the product information would change on the back end, like due to a database update or something, we might want an easy way to actually clear the cache just specific to this product and not for all products or for the entire site. And so with that, what we could do is actually define a surrogate key within our cache handler that we set up in the router. And we can base that surrogate key off a specific product ID, for example. And so let's go back at the code and head back over to our router. And for get product, what we want to do is just a quick background of how the route operation works. So the router, whenever it comes through and the requests are handled in the order in which they are defined. So for example, the get product request, whenever there's a request that comes in with the GraphQL operation to get product, this cache handler is first executed before anything else. and it basically sets in the response headers the cache information. Because setting cache information doesn't actually return the response immediately, the request is still processed later throughout the router. And so the next step that it's actually going to get processed on is under next routes. And so after we set the cache information, then internally our Next.js connector is going to go through and actually process it as a next route, run it through the whole API endpoint handler that we had set up previously. So what we want to do is, if we're actually going to come through here and set up a surrogate key, the first thing we actually need to do is come up here where our router library is, and there's a function we can call called derive surrogate key from JSON. And then down here within our route handler, so we also need to bring in the render with app function. And what this is going to do is basically we can take the request that's coming in and tell it to be processed through our backend application, which is going to be Next.js. But it also gives us some additional functionality, such as transforming the request and transforming the response before it's actually sent back. So let's open this up to be a new function body here. And we still want to keep our cache configuration, but then we also need to call the render with app function. And within this, we can define a few options. What we're looking for here is when the response comes back, we actually want to transform this response and use the drive surrogate key from JSON function to actually take the JSON response back and pull out some information, such as the product ID, that we want to use to define an actual surrogate key for this particular request. So this handler takes a function that's actually going to return the JSON that comes back in the response. And what we want to do is we just want to create a string template of basically the surrogate key is going to be defined as product dot and then the name of the product ID that comes back in the JSON response. And so let's save this, and when we save it, the router gets recompiled. So let's head back over to the app and just refresh the product here. Let's take a look at the difference in the response. So now you can see that we have the X0 surrogate key, and the value is defined as product dot and then the actual product ID. It doesn't necessarily have to be the actual product ID. Any unique identifier that you want to use to actually define your surrogate key is going to be fine. And then this value can be used in both the Layer0 developer console, or it could be passed to our REST API to clear cache for this very specific product. So that wraps up what I wanted to discuss today on using Apollo Server and GraphQL on Layer0 for caching your responses. I'll have the source for this project published here on GitHub, so you can check this out locally and test everything out yourself. You can also find more information on our documentation site at docs.layer0.co. And even with this example, we have a one-click deploy option, which allows you to go directly to the example application within our document. With the click of a button, deploy this to your own GitHub repository and deploy it live on Layer0. If you're new to Layer0, feel free to test drive by going to app.layer0.co/signup to get started today. Any additional help, feel free to visit the forums at forum.layer0.co. Thanks and have a great day.